And so it is with joy that I am about to introduce Anne-Marie to come and preach this morning. I've got to know Anne-Marie a little bit over the last few months. It's been good to sit and eat cake together. I mean, that's always a joy, isn't it? And just get to know her heart a little bit. I know she's going to share very much her journey. And so as she comes up now, should we give her a warm welcome as she comes to speak?
Good morning, Kingsway Church. When Deb asked me to preach this morning for the dedication service, I felt really honoured and a little bit overwhelmed. I think I just said yes before I even had time to think about it, to be honest. And because sometimes we just have to get out of our comfort zone, don't we? And if God says jump, you have to say how high. So this is the first time I'm actually preaching on a Sunday morning. But I had the phrase great expectations on my heart for months. And it started with just the phrase rattling around in my head one week really randomly. And you know God's up to something when that happens. And it was confirmed on the 15th of January when, in this church, Berkeley had given a word in tongues. And it got interpreted with the very phrase, great expectations. So I knew God was definitely onto something. And at first I didn't really understand what he was saying, but I told Deb and I kept mulling it over, asking what he wanted to say, and it's resulted in this today. So I'm going to loosely hang it on the story of Abraham in Genesis because he was a man of great expectations. And I'm going to talk about a few recent expectations from my own life. So the subtitle, what's on there, is How Dedicated to God's Purposes and Plans Are You? Because during the service today, we've dedicated Oliver and Joshua to God, but we're also dedicating ourselves as parents to bring him up in the Christian faith. And like Deb said, if they choose to get baptised when they're older, that's their own personal choice. But what is the best way we can bring children up as Christians? It's simply to model Christ, isn't it? Because kids learn by modelling your behaviour. If I snap and shout at them, then they snap and shout back at me. And I'm learning that every time I react, they see the reaction and model it. And our behaviour does speak louder than words. So if we're dedicated to God ourselves, then surely as we live out our lives as a demonstration of this, then our children and others will see it and want to follow God's plans. Well, that's the theory, isn't it? So it's a challenge for me and myself as much as I'm throwing it out there as a challenge to everyone else. Now, I only know about a quarter of the congregation here because we only moved to Womben last September. So I thought I'd better give a brief introduction other than my name is Anne-Marie. You might see me around every now and then over the past 30 years because my nan was Betty Hackwood and she was a lifelong member here before she passed away. And my husband, Steve, well, this was his home church too until I stole him away to Durham in 2015. And we got married and had 2 children there in the previous 8 years. But when I told my husband, Steve, that I was going to preach this Sunday on great expectations, his first words were, "Oh, that's all right, because that's just the story of your life, isn't it?" And I was like, I'm not really sure what he meant, to be honest, but I think he meant that I've always had lots of grand ideas and plans and things I'd love to do, which he normally just says, "Oh, that's blue sky thinking, and you should get back down to earth and get on with looking after the boys." But I've always had ambitions, ranging from becoming a teacher, becoming Prime Minister, writing a book, becoming a property developer, or maybe being an artist or, setting up a cafe. Some of these things I've achieved, others have been firmly laid to rest, and some are still just on the bucket list. And I think it is good to have great expectations to keep moving forward, but I'm slowly learning it's also about discovering about what God's expectations of us are. And like I said, Abraham was a man God had great expectations and blessings for. So I'm going to read from Genesis 22 this morning, where God tests his faith. Prior to this passage, when Abraham was about 75, God had hinted that he would have a son, but then he gets to the ripe old age of 99 and he's still waiting. In the 25 years of waiting, though, he tries to speed up this promise, and he has a son called Ishmael with his wife's maid, because his wife Sarah is barren, and they wonder how God is going to otherwise fulfill his promise of being a father to many nations. But when he reaches 100 and Sarah's 90, they have a son called Isaac, which means he laughs, and he becomes a father. However, in Genesis 22 it says, "Sometime later, God tested Abraham. He said to him, 'Abraham.' 'Here I am,' he replied. Then God said, 'Take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains I will tell you about.' Early the next morning, Abraham got up and saddled his donkey. He took with him 2 of his servants and his son Isaac. When he had cut enough wood for the burnt offering, he set out for the place God had told him about. On the third day, Abraham looked up and saw the place in the distance. He said to his servants, "You stay here with the donkey while I and the boy go over there. We'll worship and then we'll come back to you." Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering and placed it on his son Isaac, and he himself carried the fire and the knife. As the two of them went on together, Isaac spoke up and said to his father Abraham, "Father?" "Yes, my son," he replied. "The fire and the wood are here, but where's the lamb for the burnt offering?" Abraham answered, "God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son." And the two of them went on. When they reached the place God had told him about, Abraham built an altar and arranged the wood on it. He bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Then he reached out his hand and took a knife to slay his son. But the angel of the Lord called out to him from heaven. "Abraham, Abraham, here I am," he replied. "Do not lay a hand on the boy," he said. "Do not do anything to him. Now I know that you fear God, because you have not withheld from me your only son." And then down to verse 16, and said, "I swear by myself, declares the Lord, that because you have done this and have not withheld your son, your only son, I will surely bless you and make descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and as the sand is on the seashore. Your descendants will take possession of the cities of their enemies, and through your offspring all nations of the earth will be blessed, because you have obeyed me." And I mean, God certainly does have some weird and wonderful ideas, doesn't he? Can you even imagine being asked to do that? But you know, the key message here today is that God had a long-term plan. There wasn't an immediate outcome. It was 99 to 100 years in the making before Abraham even got his son. But the key is the promise didn't change. The promise always stood and God was faithful. But the bigger issue in this passage is how dedicated was Abraham? Because he'd started to get cold feet 14 years earlier when he thought, "Oh, I'm not sure. God promised me a son, but he doesn't seem to be delivering on this, does he? So I'll just have a son with Hagar." But in this passage, we see he is totally dedicated to God, because through his obedience, he offers to sacrifice his own son. And I wonder, do we ever doubt what God says to us and try to rush ahead and get carried away with our own great expectations in life? So here are some recent examples from my own experience that I felt that I should share today. Our first most recent great expectation was in moving our family 200 miles south from Durham to Womben to help look after my mum. Her health had been rapidly declining since she caught COVID the year before. She couldn't walk and she could hardly talk, so we decided, or rather pushed Steve into moving house. But it's all right because it's from Womben anyway, so he didn't mind. And it all seemed like it was God's plan. When the house directly next door come up for sale in March, Steve got offered a job transfer, and it was all going swimmingly after we got through the mortgage hurdles. And I was all geared up to become my mum's carer. We had all these great ideas. Well, I had all these great ideas. I was going to get her rehabilitated. I'd get her walking and talking again. I would save her life, or at least push her in a wheelchair to get to the shops to improve her quality of life. But then 3.5 months later, she passed away. She didn't really have a quality of life anymore, and she didn't want to be here. And then all my expectations in moving were completely dashed. At the same time, we were in the process of deciding to move in the March. We just found out I was pregnant again. And there I was with my second great expectation, this time of motherhood. I mean, you'd think I'd have learned that motherhood isn't all you imagine it to be after the experience with our firstborn. But no, I was adamant we needed a third child, because, you know, it might just be a girl, and we've got 2 boys, so why don't we just try for a girl, you know? And I had this vision that it would be a breeze, that I'd waltz around pushing a pushchair with another cute little baby on the school run, and that it couldn't possibly be any harder than the first child anyway, so there was nothing to lose. And I was wrong. Our third baby, Joshua, is even harder than the other 2 put together, so I think God is having a bit of a laugh sometimes, just like when he delivered Isaac, which means he laughs. Because I always had great expectations of having children in general, until we'd had their first. And honestly, absolutely nothing prepared me for that. Samson, bless him. He was absolutely beautiful from day one, but he did nothing but cry and scream with silent reflux, which made him really irritable. Our second child seemed to avoid this condition, and we were lulled into this false sense of security of easy babyhood. But when Joshua was born, everything just went wrong. He was in hospital for a week at 7 days old, and then he developed reflux just like the first. But then it was made 100 times worse, which I didn't think was possible, believe me, because he has this floppy larynx, which makes him really, really upset. So most of the day, I just spend holding this crying baby, thinking about all the great things that I should be doing. But this is the reality. And I think God's a bit like, no, you've still got more lessons here in this motherhood malarkey to learn. But this got me thinking, We have great expectations of our children, don't we? And I think it starts when they're born. When they shatter your self-orientated little world because life becomes about someone else other than yourself, and then you start to selfishly long for the sleep that you used to have, to be able to get up to your own agenda, to not be woken up for a feed or a random nightmare in the middle of the night. And then you start to set expectations that that baby is one day soon going to sleep through the night, that they'll fit into this little routine of what I want to do, and the expectations go on from there. I mean, our oldest son, he's only 7, and I obviously expect him to get dressed every day, although he would definitely prefer not to. But you know, how hard is that? Since he started school, I feel like I must say, can you get dressed now, please? Can you get dressed now, please? Can you put your shoes on, get your bag packed, same we do every day, you know? Can you get dressed, please? At least 10 to 100 times every morning before any movement in the right direction happens. And I don't know if it's just boys or just our boys, but getting them to do some of the most basic tasks is really hard work. Maybe I expect too much. Or maybe it is just hard work. But when I was listening to myself on repeat every day, I started to think, gee whiz, this is what God must be like with us every day. I bet he looks at us and goes, I wish they'd just listen to me. I wish they'd just do as I say, and then we can crack on with things a lot quicker, just like we say to our own kids. But we don't always follow instructions very well, do we? And I think that's partly due to the problem of free will, but also because we're not always that dedicated to the course. Sometimes we take our eye off the ball, and Jesus is the perfecter of our faith. In Hebrews 12, Paul writes to the Hebrews, encouraging them to persevere in their faith. And after talking about some of the greats in the Old Testament, like Abraham, in Hebrews 12 he says, therefore, since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, let us throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles, and let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of faith. For the joy set before him, he endured the cross, scorning its shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. You see, some races, they go around in circles, don't they? And you start back where you finish, like in the amphitheatres in Rome. Whereas in other races, they take you on a course and you end up somewhere different. But either way, there's always a starting point and always a finishing point. But we believe that the course is set by God as Christians, that he holds the map, so to speak. And God probably has a direct plan for each of us on how to get from A to B, but there's a lot of routes that could get you there due to the very nature of free choice and our common lack of obedience to do everything God tells us to do and when he tells us to do it. This means that some routes are slower than others, some lead down dead ends, some go in circles around the block, some might even get a bit lost on, or you might go completely off course. But there is always a way back and another way of getting from A to B. Whether you run the course, drive the course, walk the course, fly it, or crawl, what matters is that you persevere and stick the course of faith, even when times get tough. Because if we're not dedicated, how are our children going to follow God? It's okay reading about Abraham and all the other people in the Bible that follow God, but our children need us as earthly role models, running that race marked out for us. Now, like I said, we've recently moved from the northeast, and up north, there's this 13-mile half marathon race called the Great North Run. I mean, I've never run it myself because I am not that athletic at all. But I've been with my dad a few times, and when I was younger as a spectator, and watched my stepmom and stepbrother run it. And it starts on the River Tyne in Newcastle. Then we used to just, get the tube to sunny South Shields where it ended. And we'd just soak up the atmosphere with the red arrows display at the end, and it was spectacular. You got to capture all the excitement and the glorious finish without any effort. But I'm told it's not as rewarding as actually running the race up the coastline at the end, being in it, overcoming all those stitches and the pain and the endurance along the way and the self-fulfillment you get at the end. And that's a bit like the Christian walk, isn't it? It's easy to be a spectator, but if we're not walking the walk and running the race faithfully according to God's plan outside this building on a Sunday morning, then what's the point? It just makes us spectators of faith instead of the dedicated believers we're meant to be. But more importantly, you don't win a prize if you don't actually participate in the race. And the prize is a heavenly reward. The goal isn't necessarily perfection, but at least progress towards some greater godly expectation. And the Charles Dickens novel of Great Expectations, which is where I thought the sermon was leading in the first place, I thought, I can't read the book, I haven't got time, I better watch the DVD. So it's actually on the BBC at the minute on Sunday evenings. There's a coincidence. And it's actually about progress in Charles Dickens' novel, about a young boy called Pip, who has great expectations of himself, and he wants to move his way up through society, and he dreams of becoming a gentleman from a blacksmith. And fortune just so happens that he gets this magnificent inheritance and abundance of wealth, and he's able to enter high society and become educated, and then he achieves his great expectation and becomes a gentleman. But just like the story of the prodigal son in the Bible, at one point he squanders all his wealth and ends up in debt and back home where he started in poverty. But he's learned moral lessons along the way. And sometimes you have to go full circle to learn these lessons, even though it might look like you're back where you started. You've actually made progress. And I've looked back over the past 19 years since I became a Christian and wondered, have I stuck to the plan all the time? And I'm going to be honest, absolutely not. I've gone round in circles, spirals, sometimes even maybe. Sometimes I've been on fire for God, and other times I've just point blank ignored him or been too busy bringing up these children. I've definitely got lost along the way, but I've always somehow been drawn back, and that's why I'm bringing the message today. When I became a Christian, it was actually through a sermon by my mother-in-law down here, Wendy Sheldon, who was giving a talk at New Horizons. I don't think they allow kids there now, but my nana dragged me along during the summer holidays one summer. Lucky she did, really. And all I remember was it was about choices and making the right choice. And at the end, she offered to pray for people that wanted to choose to follow God. Because we have to choose to dedicate ourselves to God, don't we? And we have to choose to follow and act on what God says. But we're not here today to christen or baptise Joshua, we're here to dedicate them. And dedication, by definition, means 1, devoted to a task or purpose, or 2, exclusively allocated or intended for a particular purpose. And I think the second definition is more how God sees it, to be exclusively allocated to something. And I often wonder, what am I exclusively allocated to, apart from being a full-time mum to 3 boys? Because, like I said, I get these random great expectations of things that I want to do. And sometimes I do get glimpses of what I think God wants me to do, or, he just shouts it in my ear, or plants it right in front of my face if I don't listen to him the first time round. And about 9 years ago, I took a gap year after I trained to be a maths teacher. I took on a church internship in Durham because I felt God was actually calling me to do something different and set up a community cafe. It seemed a bit wild, as I thought I was going to be a teacher. But I was only 24 then, and the world seemed like my oyster, and I had these crazy great ambitions about how I could maybe, do education differently and still teach these young people or unemployed people to work in this cafe. But I had no experience how to run a cafe, let alone training anyone else how to work in one. But that didn't seem to matter to God, because it happened anyway. The opportunities came out of nowhere. So I started a social enterprise course, and that provided a business startup training. And they taught me how to apply for grants for funding to run it. And then there was another local church in the same place at the same time who were thinking about setting up a coffee shop, and they had volunteers that wanted to serve. And then a premises right at the end of the street where we lived became available to set it up in, such that all these stars aligned in a series of God incidences, and it just happened we opened this cafe. And it did. It became a little community hub where everyone chipped in. I trained some unemployed volunteers in basic food safety. I made cakes, served a lot of tea. And there was a little youth group that we did healthy eating and cooking courses with. And then a group of young mums and babies started coming, making friendships. We had a food bank there. There was internet access, so people could come and write CVs. Even the job centre approached us at one point and said, "Can you help all these unemployed people?" And it was like, oh, the task's a bit bigger, yeah. But it was a little hive of activity. And I even managed to write a master's dissertation on it, and looking at all the different ways that education was happening in this tiny little cafe space. And for those 2 years, it felt like I was living God's calling, that I was listening to whatever he told me and just doing it without a second thought. But then we got married. And I fell pregnant with our first child, and I quickly realised that I couldn't really do this community project and be a full-time mum. So I was wondering what happened to all this dreaming and believing about God wanting to run this cafe. Surely it wasn't just to write a master's dissertation. Until we moved 200 miles down south, and we ended up here at Kingsway Church, and the first Sunday we turn up, there's Deb at the front, talking about opening a cafe right here. So then I was all ears. With all my dashed expectations of what we were moving for, because my mum had just passed away, I was drowning in the depths of parenthood with this third child, wondering what I'm doing with my life, and God throws this curveball. And he puts a picture of a little teapot that says tea for 2 in turquoise right in front of my face and says, "See, I haven't forgotten. There was a purpose I asked you to start up a cafe almost a decade ago. And you can move 200 miles down the country, have 3 children in tow if you want, but I still want you to be part of this, because when I start a good work, it isn't for nothing. There's a plan and a purpose, and I intend to finish it." So I've come full circle and found myself resurrecting this cafe dream that God gave me 10 years earlier, because God has greater expectations and plans and purposes, bigger than mine, and he doesn't give up. And just like with Abraham, the plan is often longer term than you can actually see for yourself, but he predestined us. So this morning I'm asking, are you listening? Is God shouting or whispering in your ear or reminding you to do something for him? Maybe he's simply asking you to get dressed while you're in your metaphorical pajamas like our son. Maybe he's asked you 100 times to do something, but you're still not moving. My question is, what does God want you to do, and are you dedicated to his service? Will you be obedient to his calling? Because if you're not dedicated, how is anyone else around you going to be dedicated? In our house, if Samson isn't getting dressed, then Elijah isn't getting dressed either. So I've got a model getting dressed, and believe me, I need the full armour of God to get those kids dressed on a morning. So let's get us back in the race. Whether you've taken a detour, whether you've come off track, or if you're in a different race altogether, get back into God's race and find out what kingdom task he's got for you. I'd like to pray for some people this morning for their calling, or to pray into things that God thinks that you think God might have been asking you to do or promised in the past. Because there's no guarantees in life, but if God promises something, then he always sees it through. In Jeremiah 29, this is what the Lord says. When 70 years are completed for Babylon, I will come to you and fulfill my good promise to bring you back to this place. For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord. Plans to prosper and not to harm you. Plans to give you a hope and a future. Then you will call on me and pray to me, and I will listen to you. You will seek and find me, and when you seek me with all your heart, I will be found by you. But he has great expectations for us. We just have to choose if we're going to dedicate ourselves to them too. Do you trust him with your life, or even your child's life, like Abraham? Because we're dedicating Joshua to God today. I just would like to ask, would you dedicate yourself too? And if God says jump, would you ask how high?